Welcome. So glad you're here. Um, yeah, sorry if I have trouble here, but my screen is flashing at me. So it seems like an ominous connection, but I'm going to go forward. So as long as you can hear me, Scott, give me a hand or something if you can't hear me.
Yeah,
So
I can hear you fine. Your video's frozen, but that's fine as long as we can hear you.
the video is frozen.
Yeah, your video's frozen, but the audio's coming through just fine.
Okay. All right. So anyway, let me start this.
You're back.
All right. Whoa. How's that?
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay. So, with the little education we've been doing the past couple of weeks, or more than that now, 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks during this COVID crisis, we've been really focusing on kind of skills to manage inside, whether it's dealing with anxiety or stress reduction or that kind of thing. And I got a little emailing from a colleague of mine today about 10 ways to reduce stress at home. And I just liked them because they're a little bit different than what we normally have been seeing or doing. And I thought it would just be useful again to kind of remind us for some of these skills that are easy to do. I'm going to take 6 of them that I thought were great. But the first one in this list was to don't wallow in comfort. And I've heard friends, and I've had the experience too, where every day kind of blends together. If you're not going out, a lot of us are busy on the computer and just, I saw a funny thing on TV yesterday of some news guy giving his report from home with his tie and his blazer, and he didn't realize that the corner of his table was exposed and he was wearing shorts or underwear or something. It was like, oh dear. But I think, I won't tell you what I'm wearing now, but a lot of people, I am wearing something, but a lot of us are doing that right from home. But I think we kind of get caught up in this, like one day blends into the other and it all kind of merges. And I think it's not really good for our brains. It's not really good for our emotional health. And the quote in this little article that he said, I thought it was so funny. Remember that in Seinfeld, Jerry told George, sweatpants are just a way of telling the world I give up. I think, it feels good to get up and shower and get dressed to a certain degree and carry on. But I think sometimes we can just kind of just drop into ourselves if we don't have to go out in the world too much, even though we're online like this, it can be problematic. So I think it's really important to kind of get up and do and follow a routine. I have dogs, so we have to get up at the same time, and that kind of keeps my life somewhat regimented. But I know friends that are kind of staying up late and getting up late, and the whole world is kind of turning upside down, and they're getting out of sync with their rhythms in life. So I think we just really have to kind of impose a structure that normally would be provided for us from the outside, like a more formal work structure of going somewhere and working. A lot of us are working hard right now, especially in the mental health field, but we're doing it in a different way from home. So I think just to kind of get up and do and make the motions and take care of yourself just makes you feel better. It's like kind of making your bed in the morning. It makes you feel better, even if your mom's not around to tell you to do it anymore. So that was one thing. Don't wallow in comfort. The next thing was walk it, work it. And the other thing I've been trying to do is really get out and do some exercise every day. And that for me is mostly taking a walk now. And with the apps, we can really track our mileage and kind of get a sense of what we're doing. But for me, I notice the walk is not so much just the benefit of physical exercise. It really keeps my head on straight. And I think that is probably the biggest. I've been aware of this always, but that was one of really big surprise for me, how much a walk outside can just connect my brain to my feelings and to my creativity, and I can come back and write or work or do a session or whatever I need to do much more refreshed. It just kind of gets me out. If I can connect with the sky and get outside and breathe, it really makes a difference. So I think that's just movement and physical exercise. And if you can do more than walking, that's great. I have friends who are riding bicycles on long treks and doing things like that. And I think it's all really beneficial. But my point here is that walking is not just good for us physiologically, it really helps our mindset and our mind capacity to deal with emotions and to be connected and to be awake, to kind of be vibrant. Our brains were hardwired to need novelty, right? That's one of the big problems with sex addiction is that it's all about novelty and getting something new and exciting to keep the intensity and the stimulation going. But if we don't have novelty, and this is just how we're hardwired, our brains kind of go to sleep. They do start doing everything by rote and in automatic ways, and we're not really present. And so I think it really kind of helps wake our minds up when we walk. And certainly if you can add a mindfulness practice to that, that would be even better. The third one, and I've mentioned this before in our webinar here tonight, but my friend suggested putting a news quota on yourself. You know, I think the news right now, I think some of us remember the days when the bulk of televised news was 30 minutes once a night, you know, and there are 3 networks and that was it. And with cable TV now in the last 20 years, we have the accessibility to news all the time, and oftentimes just to keep ratings up, I think it's extreme news, it's scary news, it's anxious, and there's a lot of scary reality out there too. But I think if we dip into it too much, it's really problematic. And I am totally guilty of this myself. I admit that I get kind of an addictive rush out of like watching the news and the breaking news and you know, oh my God, and my heart rate goes, and there's an intensity and excitement to that I really recognize as kind of addictive in a way. And so to really not get into that, not scare myself to death, to be informed. I don't want to cut myself off either. So I do read, I do rely on some news, but I want to stay, you know, informed, but I also don't want to live 24/7 in this news cycle, and just kind of have a step out of it and really take care of myself and try to keep things in perspective. The other rule I have, I've shared this before too, is watching news right before you go to sleep. I think news is upsetting for the most part, especially these days, and it can really kind of trigger us and cause a lot of anxiety. It's not a good state to go to sleep in. So I recommend kind of turning off all electronics if you can an hour before bed. No social media, no TV, no news, or just something easy, nice and easy, you know, Golden Girls reruns or something like that, but not so much the news. Bright siding. This is an expression I've started to hear lately. You know, as opposed to looking at the downside or the dark side, to bright side, which simply means trying to keep some perspective and balance in how we're looking at things, right? That not everything is, and there's a lot of bad stuff, and I'm not going to try to minimize that out there, but there's also some really amazing stuff. You know, there's the guy who sent his N95 masks to the healthcare workers in New York, and there's people that are sacrificing themselves. There's people doing amazing service with food banks and support, and just the generosity and the American spirit, I think, is really on full display here if we can see it. And I know some of the stories, the news stories are trying to highlight some of those aspects as well, but I think it doesn't always come through. And I think we, in our own ways of looking at the world and interpreting stuff, and even impact on our own lives, you know, is there a bright side to this? You know, is there a bright side to, you know, being around? For me, the one bright side is not being on the road so much. You know, I'm home. I'm really loving being home for almost 2 months, which hasn't happened in years. And fortunately, I live with a partner that I like, you know, and so we're doing things, we're cooking together, and we're having fun together, and we're playing with the dogs more. And I'm more present in my own life. So that's one bright side. I practice gratitude, another tool we talk about here all the time, but gratitude for the things in my life. I have food in the fridge. You know, for today, I have, you know, money to pay the rent, and so, you know, things are okay. And just trying to remain somewhat balanced in my approach is going to be really important, I think, for all of us, because it's really easy to do that, what we call negativity bias, where we just start to see just all the bad stuff, you know, the glass half full approach to the world. And that's actually a thing called negativity bias, where we don't notice the good stuff around us. And so we have to kind of train our brain to be balanced, at least, and to notice the good stuff, the beautiful moments, as well as the downside. 2 more. He said, don't agonize, organize. And that's really true. I think, you know, we can sit around and be distressed. We can also make use of the time that we're often stuck in our homes. And so there's projects around. I have, you know, I call it my drawer of death stuff. I just stick the drawer in and close it and try not to worry about it. But those kind of little corners in my place, I'm trying to get to and organize and throw things out and kind of clean up my life a little bit. And it's a nice way to spend the time. I'm also trying to have some writing projects. I have deadlines for that I'm trying to get done. So I'm trying to make use of this time in a way that's healthy and productive. So I don't come out of this at the end saying, my God, I just woke up from a bad dream. There's some things that we can do to make good use of the time. And finally, get around to it is what he said. And I think we all have projects or important things in our lives that we don't like to do, we avoid. One of those, I've talked to my friends about this, is estate planning. This is a time when we think about, God, what if the worst things were to happen? What untidy pieces are there out there that need to be straightened up, or what questions remain, or what can I do to clarify, just to make sure it's easy on the people that I love should something bad happen. So that kind of difficult stuff, but also a more pleasant task that I've been putting off and getting around to now is organizing family photos. I have family photos for years that most of my digital stuff the last 10 or 15 years are pretty easy because they're on the computer, but I have a ton of print photos that I really like to organize and get digitized. And so those kind of projects also are useful. So bottom line is that we can do things, I think, to make ourselves feel present in our lives and reduce the stress by not focusing on it all the time, by taking care of ourselves, eating well, exercising, and really making use of the time. We have this kind of moment. And the other idea that I'm just starting to think about, I just have been reading about lately, is like, we're not going to go back to probably normal. And there's been a lot of writers lately who are saying, maybe we shouldn't go back to normal. Maybe this is an opportunity to really kind of reorganize how we do things in our lives and maybe as a society. So interesting ideas to think about. But so that's my 2 cents for tonight on self-care. And I'll turn it over to you, Scott, and we can go forward.
Thank you, David. As you're going through the list, I'm about 50-50, so I could do better. I have been right-siding, the gratitude lists, and I like the last thing you said is maybe I don't want my life to go back to normal. Maybe this is a chance to reset and make some changes, rethink, how I approach certain things. This has been a positive experience for me in that respect. So I'm very good with the news quota. The news makes me crazy.
Yeah.
And I have been showering and getting dressed, although I'm growing the Corona beard, but that's not laziness. That's just, I wanted to try it while, people can't see it in person. Just remind everybody, this is an interactive webinar, which means you get to ask questions, and David and I will answer them. And I see we've got some already, so rather than me prattling on, let's get to our questions. Use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or you can use a chat feature. Just try and direct it at David and I, so the whole world doesn't see your name. So first question, other than childhood trauma, what can cause the development of a sexual addiction? Good question.
Great question. So really the classic formula to create any addiction is often some kind of trauma or traumatic experience. And that's a really broad definition of trauma. It can include neglect. It can include unusual circumstances. It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual or emotional or physical abuse, although it often is, unfortunately. But trauma is certainly a key focus of that. The other primary way we see sex addiction developing now are where trauma is not involved, or among young men who have grown up on pornography. The accessibility of it, the privacy of it, the cost of it, we're basically free, and it's really kind of hijacked some of their sexual and intimacy development. And so we see a lot of people having issues with that and having trouble with developing erectile dysfunction and developing sex addiction and really having issues that are not really the result of trauma, but really more their habits of consistent porn use. Scott, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
First of all, I wanted to add, that trauma is just this wide swath of experience. Trauma specialists differentiate between little t traumas and big T traumas. A big T trauma is, cancer or a car accident or you get shot or, big T trauma, obvious trauma. Little T traumas are the day-to-day things that eat at us a little bit, getting bullied at school or being neglected at home or, not getting your emotional needs met from your partner or, all kinds of things that just add up over time. And in terms of long-term effects, little T trauma actually can be much worse than big T trauma, primarily because the big T traumas, we deal with them. The little T traumas, we tamp them down and ignore them, and they just stay in there and fester and go bad and create shame. And shame is the #1 driver of addiction. Trauma leads to shame, shame leads to addiction. The other point I wanted to make about trauma is it's really subjective. What's traumatic for me may not be for you. And the example that I always give is you've got a new mother in her car with a baby in the back seat, and she accidentally bumps the car in front of her going 5 miles an hour and freaks out. Whereas a NASCAR driver hits the wall at the, Daytona at 200 miles an hour, pops out of the car and gives an interview and says, wasn't that fun? Just completely different perspective on trauma. Hitting a wall at 200 miles an hour kind of feels like big T to me, and bumping somebody in front of me feels like, no big deal. But depending on who you are, it can look really, really different. Did you want to add anything to that, David? Or?
Yeah, I would say too, oftentimes those little T traumas that you talked about, I absolutely agree with everything you said, but oftentimes there's some excess shame about that, and sometimes even they're stigmatized. Sometimes being bullied not only is a traumatic experience, but people feel some shame about it and often don't want to talk about it. It's, if you're in a terrible car accident, you get sympathy and help and assistance, but oftentimes some of those other forms of trauma, we don't. And so that can happen. And then the other thing I would say is that sometimes I've seen sex addiction develop as a secondary addiction, right? So if you have somebody who's maybe a meth user, who's really going for the intensity and the effect of the drug, suddenly finds themselves acting out in a sexually high-risk way. And so it can kind of develop that way as well. So yeah, something we do see for sure.
Yeah, to David's first point there, there's research, the guy at UCLA whose name is escaping me, but he's a big trauma guy, and he's done a lot of research, and he finds that trauma within the family, if it's dealt with, it doesn't have long-term effects. If it's not dealt with, the fact that it's not dealt with is usually more traumatic than the actual traumatic event. Like if a girl is molested by her uncle, if the family deals with it, the girl is able to move on. If the family doesn't deal with it, the silence around it usually ends up causing more pain and trauma than the actual molestation, which sounds crazy, but it's really true. We need to get it out. And addicts, we don't. We learn early in our lives that other people can't be trusted. David, your image is frozen. I just feel like I should keep talking.
Hey, no, Scott, I'm going to sign out and come back, okay?
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
I'll look for you to come back in and promote you. So, what I was saying is, we learn early in our lives that, mom and dad can't be trusted to consistently provide safe support to us. So we, and our teachers, whatever, they were inconsistent. Our parent was addicted, or they were just crazy. I had one parent who was an alcoholic, a functioning alcoholic, but emotionally absent, and the other parent who was insanely inconsistent. I never knew when I came home from school which mom was waiting on the other side of the door. Good mom or bad mom? Good mom, great. Bad mom, scary. I sometimes say the best moments of my childhood were with my mother, and the worst moments of my childhood were with my mother. So I learned early on to just shut up and to get my needs met elsewhere. And I started drinking in middle school. I experimented with drugs in middle school, and I learned about masturbation and sexual behavior in middle school. And those became my go-to coping mechanisms because they worked a lot better than reading or, just playing stupid fantasy games or whatever. and those became my go-to coping mechanisms, and they quickly became addiction. Let's see if David's back in yet. Not yet. Okay, I'll check again in a second. So that's how addiction starts. The conditioning part of addiction, the one thing David didn't mention, and he did mention we see a lot of young people using porn, and they get hooked on it through conditioning more than trauma. But the one thing that people tend to ignore in that equation is, if you're 10 years old and you're looking at porn, 4 or 5 hours a day, that alone is probably traumatic. You're seeing things that you're not ready to see, and that's gonna be traumatic. So there's a lot of trauma there. Is David back in yet? I'm sorry, everybody, technical difficulties. He is not. We'll check again in a minute. So next question here. I recently obtained sobriety during COVID. Given the social distancing requirements and such, how do you suggest starting the 12 steps and obtaining a sponsor? Now, first of all, congratulations for getting sober in the middle of a world crisis. Good for you. That's not something I think a lot of people are doing. I think a lot of people have had sobriety and lost it during this crisis, but not a lot of people are getting sober in this crisis. So I applaud you for that. Social distancing, it has I'll give you my story. I usually attend 3 or 4 in-person meetings a week, in addition to the webinars and drop-in groups that I do online through sexandrelationshiphealing.com. And we also have a group for people who work in the sex addiction recovery field who are recovering sex and porn addicts like myself. So I go to that. So, there's 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 or 9 meetings a week that I go to. About half of them are in person, half of them are online. The in-person meetings I really miss right now. There's something special about going to meetings in person. Let's see if David's back yet. He's not. He's having some serious internet problem. He may just have me for a little while there. Somebody just joined. Come on. There he is. Hang on. David will be rejoining us as a host in just a second. It's tougher to have that group connection when you're not in person. I think it's tougher to find a sponsor when you're not in person. Welcome back, David.
Hi, sorry.
That's all right. Our question, we're on to the second question, which is, I recently obtained sobriety during COVID. Congratulations, as I said. Given social distancing requirements and such, how do you suggest starting the 12 steps and obtaining a sponsor? I was just getting around to, there are 12-step online meetings. And I would just go onto the Sex Addicts Anonymous site, or Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, or Sexaholics Anonymous, or Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. They have meetings almost every day. They're just like this. You click a button, you're in, and just announce yourself as a newcomer and you're looking for some support. You can also find 12-step meetings on intherooms.com, which we occasionally partner with that website to host events. So yeah, I would go online that way and just put it out that you need some help and you'd like to start working the steps, and can somebody help you out with that? And probably somebody will send you in the chat feature, hey, my name is Joe, here's my phone number, give me a call, happy to help. And if not, go to another meeting and do it again. So David, thoughts on that?
Yeah, really the same thing. I mean, the meetings have done a pretty remarkable job moving online really quickly to expand the base of meetings that are out there. So I think going online, the problem with it in these days is that you miss a very important aspect of the meeting, which I think is the fellowship, right? The fellowship before and afterwards, which is harder. The going out to coffee, the having dinner, they're just, just spending some time before or after the meeting, which is where a lot of those important relationships and the connection are really established. So I think that's something that's harder to make up. Depending on the meeting too, I know where I am, they'll often have a temporary sponsor list, and they'll ask if anyone needs a sponsor. And I've seen that done electronically a couple times, and people can raise their hands electronically or and basically connect that way. So it's a little harder, it's more awkward, I think, but I don't think it's impossible to really get a sponsor and connect and make a good connection until we can get out there and meet face to face. But it certainly can be done. And the other thing was that there's always the phone, right? We can get phone numbers and then pick up the phone and have a pretty detailed conversation that may be less awkward and go from there. But I would, if there's not an announcement about a temporary sponsor, I would do as Scott said, just say, hey, I'm looking for one or a sponsor. If someone could give me some names or help me out, and remember, picking a sponsor is not a marriage. It's not a lifelong commitment. It's a serious commitment, but not everybody's right for everybody else. So I think it's really important to kind of, I've seen way too many people take way too long looking for the perfect sponsor, right? When we really you need a sponsor, not the perfect one. And I think just it's more important to have one than to worry about every checkbox on your list of requirements being met.
Yeah, it's I think David hit on a point that's kind of a little off topic here, but yeah, there are multiple facets to 12-step recovery. One of them is the steps, one of them is meetings, and the other one is fellowship. And the fellowship part is the part that's really difficult right now, or at least it has been for me. I miss the meeting. I always get there 20 minutes early, sometimes more, and just chat with everybody. And then I stay late, and we often go to dinner, and I miss that interaction. That's where I really get to know people beyond their addiction, and it becomes easier to pick up the phone and call them when I feel like I know them beyond just we both have the same addiction. But yeah, hang in there, and congrats again for getting sober now. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question about self-care while social distancing. How do we practice self-care and asking for what we need while being in isolation with our partners/spouses? What are some things I can do for self-care while at home? I also wanted to share that I'm 65 days sober from porn.
Wow, congratulations.
I can't tell you how much connection, support, and accountability have contributed. Thank you, Scott and David, for your service. You're welcome. David, thoughts?
Great. Yeah, I think, first of all, because of the nature of porn and the nature of this epidemic, that's a really hard thing to do. So it's a huge achievement, and I congratulate you on that. It's tough anytime, but I think it's especially tough right now. But I think a lot of the things we opened this webinar with tonight would be useful, making sure your days follow some kind of rhythm, making sure you get some physical exercise, eating well, all that self-care stuff that sounds easy, but it isn't sometimes, organizing, taking care of yourself. The other piece is really important, I think, and that's kind of a daily ritual, whatever that is for you. It can be a brief meditation, a set of prayer, it can be making a gratitude list, but I think a daily process where you kind of ground yourself and anchor yourself in your recovery throughout the day can really be helpful and practical as well. So it's really just a matter of having that intention, I think, and having the space, assuming you have the ability to get away. Sometimes it's hard in space these days, but maybe a little time by yourself to do some prayer and meditation and make a gratitude list, and maybe reach out and have a private conversation with your program friends within the confines of where you're living, that kind of stuff. It's just, we have to kind of adapt, I guess. And this is all about adaptation these days and trying to find a better way to do things. So it can totally be done, but I think it's just a matter of, sometimes I think it almost feels selfish sometimes, but I think addicts have to really take care of themselves in this regard. I think sometimes once we get into recovery, we feel we kind of relinquish the fact that we have any right to have some of that time and space. And we do need to obviously take in the impact to our partners into account and make good time of our time with them and show empathy and do a lot of the healing there. But we also, as part of our own recovery process, need to have that private time where we can do the work and connect with other people in program. So it's a matter of really carving out a rhythm for yourself and going from there.
I like that you asked about how you can engage in self-care. David and I have used the analogy about, on airplanes when the little masks come down and they always tell you put yours on first, then help your kid. And I think that applies to addiction as well. If I'm not taking care of myself, I am no good to anybody else. So I love that you're asking about self-care. I was just looking at David's list, and the first thing he said was don't wallow in comfort. And for me, I could just lose the last two words and say don't wallow, because right now I really want to wallow. I want to wear one set of pajamas until 7 p.m. and then change into another set of pajamas for bed, and then change back into the first set of pajamas at 7 a.m. Just to have a little structure. And I can't do that. I force myself to get up. I force myself to treat it like any other day. And that's part of my self-care, is to treat it like any other day. But yeah, David just gave so many good tips earlier, but good for you for self-care.
Yeah.
Any more, David?
I'll just say, only to add to that, because I think it's so easy for us right now I've heard people joking, program friends of mine, joking about how they're transferring addictions, right? They're all gaining weight, everybody's eating more and probably doing more shopping online, and kind of our anxiety and tensions are kind of working themselves out in slightly compulsive ways, in ways that aren't necessarily healthy. So I just really encourage you to beware of transferring that need for some compulsive behavior into other things that you may not have identified as addictive yet, but the impulse is there. So just be cautious.
Yeah, addictions are, we'll replace one with another pretty easily. It's the game of whack-a-mole, or it's changing seats on the Titanic, whatever you want to phrase it. We can go from food to booze to alcohol, or to drugs to sex to shopping and back to food, in an instant. Next question here. I don't seem to identify major big T trauma, but I guess there must have been quite a lot of chronic trauma or of unmet needs. So the little T trauma we were talking about. I'm not sure. I don't understand why it seems so messed up if there wasn't something pretty important that happened. How can you deal with trauma if you aren't sure what it really was? This is such a common question. David, I assume you run into this all the time, David.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. One, and I wanted to respond to that very first question about trauma too, but I'll mention it's relevant here. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, we know that witnessing trauma can be equally impactful as experiencing it yourself. So if you were a child witnessing your mother get hit or your sibling get hit, it has the same psychological impact as if you were hit yourself. And so sometimes we think we may not have experienced trauma ourselves, but we have indirectly. The other thing, and this, I had to kind of rework my notion of trauma, in that most mental health people now are starting to incorporate the idea of neglect as being traumatic. And it's something, it's kind of the opposite of trauma, if you will, in terms of physical contact or outright abuse or that kind of thing. But to be neglected when you're a child is equally impactful and traumatic. So, and then now I'm thinking of ways where you might not think of yourself as having been traumatized, but there might be something there. The other thing is, if I have a client in my office and we're talking about this, I ask them, tell me about your memories. How early do your memories go? And there's some people that don't remember anything before like 6 or 7, and that's unusual. And when we have a lack of memories, or unspecific memories, or cloudy memories, or no memories, that can be something there. And you want to work, I think, if you're interested in working with someone and with a mental health professional who really knows that kind of stuff. And there's some bad press a couple of years ago, I think, about therapists who kind of go fishing, looking for stuff, and sometimes people can have false memories. That does happen. But in the 99% of the cases, when that's occurring, something is there. And the reason people don't have memories is because of psychological defense. And so our young bodies and minds can't deal with whatever the trauma is that they're experiencing, and we kind of disconnect and float away. And that, by the way, is why trauma is such an important factor for the development of addiction, because we learn early on how to detach, how to dissociate, how to disconnect and numb. And that's exactly what addictions do. So I would take a look if you're interested. I think the other thing that, I mean, there's all kinds of things as my mind is thinking about this now. Sometimes there's other mental health issues, you know, depression, anxiety, which are very common in the United States. Those can be co-occurring disorders that can lead to addictive behavior and compulsive behavior. So, I mean, there's many avenues to it. In some regards too, and depending on where you're at in your recovery, what I always tell my clients is that it may not be so important at this point why you became an addict. The important thing is that you realize that you are, and you're going to do something about getting that addiction under control. And then once we have that stabilized, then it's important to go back and resolve whatever underlying issues might be contributing to it. But I think, you know, oftentimes people approach mental health concerns with like, oh, if I can only figure this out and get the answer to why I do this, it would resolve. And experience shows that we can have the answer, but it still doesn't resolve. We have to really work on the issue and deal with those emotional components of it. It's important and helpful to know why, but it's not the solution, or not the whole solution.
Yeah, I just want to, I popped a link into the chat feature for Enid Graves' book about neglect, which came out, I don't know, 6 months or so ago. It's really incredible. It helps, so if anybody's dealing with neglect or thinks they might be. And one of the things that she talks about is, you know, normally when we hear the word neglect, we think of a little kid, you know, wearing dirty clothes that don't fit and is hungry. And that is a neglected child, but there are so many other ways to be neglected. You know, we can be, when my therapist told me I was neglected, I thought, you're out of your mind. We had lots of money and I had nice clothes and lots of food. And, you know, the day I turned 16, I had a car, you know, all that stuff, you know, it all looked really good, but nobody ever talked to me about my emotions. In fact, I was chastised for having them. Nobody told me anything about sex. It was avoided in my house. It was dirty. So that's the message I grew up with. And that's a common message for sex addicts. And that's a form of neglect. There's spiritual neglect. There's also spiritual abuse where spirituality is used as a weapon. And there's just a lack of social modeling and relational modeling that kids get. And that too is a form of neglect. And all of those things can play into not only sex and porn and love addiction, but all sorts of psychological issues. You know, neglect is really painful. David, there's a follow-up to that question. It says, how about my mother's suicide, or my grandmother's suicide when my mother was 6 months pregnant with me? Does that qualify as trauma?
Wow, yes.
Yes,
Capital
yes.
Y. You know, this is such interesting work. Birth issues and what happens to us when we're in the womb. And, you know, a fetus is a sentient being, right? It's experiencing emotions, it's experiencing feelings and sensations. It's not necessarily having cognitive thoughts, but there are, when something like that happens, when that trauma happens, if you think about it, the fetus is literally part of the mother's bloodstream and part of her nervous system. So whatever she is feeling and reacting to, that fetus is feeling and reacting to as well. It's experiencing the shock of that loss. So absolutely, that's a huge issue. And
there are biochemical changes that the mother's going through at that point, dealing with the grief while also being pregnant and having and the fetus experiences that, right, David?
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I've read accounts of people into regression who really can describe, you know, when they could feel their mother kind of going cold or getting cut off, and you know, they're kind of on their own in this dark, scary place. So it's a total shock to both the mother and the baby that she's carrying. Absolutely. The other thing too, by the way, not just that, and that's a physiological piece. There's also a psychological component here where suicide and the trauma of suicide can really get passed on from generation to generation. And there's actually epidemiological studies that really look at suicide in families, suicide in society. So there's a whole component there where it gets carried on. And then I could talk all night about intergenerational trauma, which is, I think, also what we're experiencing here. And there's been a lot of work done on Holocaust survivors and not only their children, but their grandchildren who have very specific psychological traits and beliefs, and it's impacting 2 generations out. And I have no doubt it'll impact 3. So I think, yeah, these are huge issues. And I would really talk to a trauma therapist. Now, remember, a young baby, an infant that's born or pre-birth doesn't really have the cognitive wiring for thoughts, but there's a lot of feelings there. And so there's a lot of really marvelous trauma work that's being done with somatic therapies, meaning physical body work, breath work, that kind of thing, where a lot of the trauma that's resident in our bodies and our cells can be released. So yeah, I'd definitely get some work on that.
Yeah, and I mean, pushing aside all the pre-birth stuff, I mean, a newborn baby is basically a sponge that poops. I mean, they take in everything, and we learn faster in the first months of life than we learn more in our first 6 months of life than we learn in the rest of our life total. So, a newborn baby born into a house of grief is going to take that in and I think internalize that, which it just can't be helped. But yeah.
Right. And not just the physiological, the grief, but the neglect that we were just speaking of too, because if a mother who's just given birth, if her mother has just committed suicide, the mother really can't be there emotionally for the infant as she would normally. And so that's a loss right there. And so, yeah, it's a really compound and complex situation.
Yeah. Okay, I like this next question. This is from somebody who went to a CMA meeting, that's Crystal Meth Anonymous meeting on Zoom, which is what we're on now, by the way. And he says, I just witnessed an acquaintance in the CMA meeting on Zoom. He was high and half naked. It was a little triggering. I had to erase his number. I called my sponsor and I jumped into a different meeting and shared about it. Any thoughts on this?
Wow. Well, that's just, I guess, maybe the cost of doing meetings online. Of course, that behavior would never be permitted in a real live meeting. But of course, it's going to be triggering. And by the way, if you're going to CMA, you probably use Zoom for other things besides recovery groups. So just being on Zoom can be triggering. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of triggering stuff there. I'm so glad you reacted the way you did, which is to disconnect, get off that. And I'm sorry that was a really poorly run online meeting, by the way. And so you might want to choose a different meeting next time. But to really just disconnect and take care of yourself. Because when those things are triggered, it's like, something you can't unsee, right? It's there, and you have to really manage yourself and take care of yourself. And it's totally, your reaction is totally understandable and normal, and it's really unfortunate. I've heard stories like this before, where people are showing up really in an inappropriate demeanor, let me say. And so, yeah, just so really take care of yourself, and hopefully there are meetings that are better run about than that, but that's really inexcusable. And that person is just so responsible, and people don't, of course, act responsibly when they're high, but there are ways to cut someone out of a meeting, and that person should have really been disconnected from the meeting.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I've been to lots of in-person 12-step meetings where somebody has come in and they're not appropriately attired, or they're really, really drunk, or really, really high and misbehaving. And, we get them out of the room. We say, you're welcome to come back when you can behave, and put some clothes on. But we get them out of the room, and in a Zoom meeting, really ought to be handled the same way. Whoever the secretary or moderator was should have popped that person out of the room.
I attend CMA meetings myself, and the ones I've been attending lately have gotten really organized, where they have a chairperson and a secretary that, like we do regular officers, but there's somebody kind of really controlling whose mic is on and who's visible, so they can instantly respond to that. So I think with practice we'll get better at controlling that behavior, but there's a need for it for sure.
Yeah, and I want to echo David's statement about kudos to you for handling it like a person in recovery who's serious about recovery. I'm really proud of you.
Yeah.
So that's great. Next question, I have a pattern of love addiction / limerence, maybe David can explain what limerence is, aimed at the teachers and supervisors in my life, not uncommon. I'm learning that this pattern is a reflection of my need to be parented as a child. I now have 3 months of no contact with a mentor. Is it always the case that no contact should last forever? Another common question. I have conflicting feelings about calling them my qualifier. I don't think this person ever harmed me. They provided me emotional support, and I distorted that in my mind as a way to regulate my emotions and attempt to resolve my childhood trauma.
Great question.
Yeah.
So let me start with limerence. For those that haven't heard me talk about this, there's this thing called limerence, which is that kind of hormonal mental illness we get when we first fall in love and become infatuated with somebody. Not quite just this side of stalker, but just kind of really, texting and phoning, and you can't think of anything else, and you're distracted, and you're deeply, deeply in love with somebody, or infatuated, I should say. And that state is called limerence. And it's not just psychological, it's hormonal. There's oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine, and all these hormones are floating around. And it's our body's way of helping us bond, pair bond, frankly, with someone. And it's kind of a chemical assist for that. And so that lasts, our bodies constantly are seeking regulation, and that lasts for 3 months or 4 months, and then it goes back to normal. And so we start to get back to our feet, land back on earth. But a lot of people who are love and romance addicts are really addicted to that state of limerence. And so they're addicted to that falling in love state. And it's a great feeling, right? When you're in that state with somebody. But oftentimes when that starts to fade, they'll kind of think, oh, I'm falling out of love, I need to find somebody else, and they'll go to the next one to get that hit of limerence. So that's one thing, and it's common with sex and love addicts, and I think we need to really be careful of that and be aware of that, and know that that's a regular occurrence in how we handle that. In terms of your larger question, I think it's very, very common to have transference, if you will, issues where we feel really connected, and we find people in our lives who in some kind of way play the role that our parents might not have done adequately for us. And it feels good, and it normally emotionally, if it's balanced and there's good boundaries, it can be very healing and productive. Unfortunately, all too often, those boundaries aren't good, oftentimes on the part of the supposedly more responsible one. And so things get really blurry and mixed. And I think just based on the nature of your question, it kind of sounds like there's been some of that mixing, and maybe between your fantasy or your projection of your ideas onto that person and vice versa. But it sounds like it's a situation that really requires some clarity. And I think the only way to get clarity is to have a really good boundary and to really separate and not have contact. And I would say in the great bulk of cases, given this past, you probably shouldn't have contact. I think everybody wants to have closure and have some kind of healthy closure and see what the other person is doing, or have that person know that I've done this growth. And, I've heard a lot of that, but I think just at least at this point, a day at a time, I would really make a boundary to not make that connection and do your own work. Every time you make that contact, I think in this space, it's like that back door out of your recovery. It's a little leak in the energy of your own recovery. You need to really contain that space and the energy so you can focus on you and the issues without the complication and confusion of that kind of interaction, my opinion. Down the road, maybe it's something you want to evaluate. If you were my sponsee or my client, I'd really caution you about that.
I wanted to pick something out of this question that really jumped out at me. The question says, I have conflicting feelings about calling this person my qualifier. I don't think this person ever harmed me. And I just want to say, this person doesn't have to harm you. This is not about the other person. This is about you. And when you set a boundary, it's not about the other person. It's about you. So this could be the nicest, most caring, thoughtful person in the world, but if you turn it into something that's unhealthy for you, you need to do something about it. And you are. So congratulations. Great. But yeah, I mean, this might be a really nice person and it might really stink to have to walk away from this person. But for your recovery, for your sanity, for your long-term health and well-being, you may really need to walk away from this person and stay away. That stinks, but it's also a fact of life. And, not everything about recovery is, smells like roses. You have to make some tough decisions sometimes. So.
And at Seeking Integrity, we do a lot of work with unmet emotional needs, and how our addiction kind of plays into those. And I would, by giving yourself some space here, it gives you a chance to see what needs do you have. And I think you've started to identify some based on your question. What needs do you have, and how can you maybe meet those needs in healthy ways? And that requires some new behavior and new intentions.
Yeah. Okay, this next question, this is a question we get a lot, although it's usually the betrayed wife asking about her betraying husband. This time it's the reverse. My sex addict wife says she ended her latest sex adventure after 30 years of such acting out about 6 months ago when her sex partner stopped it. She says she's been sober since then and is now committed to recovery, daily SAA, telemeetings, Green Book, etc. How can I believe she will not go back with that man if he changes his mind?
Well, I mean, the bottom line is there are no guarantees for this. And one of the things we always want as partners is reassurance that we can kind of exhale and settle in again, and maybe things will get back or go to a place where we feel safe and can trust fully. And in my experience, that just simply takes time. There are no guarantees about anything. And I've seen people in recovery for years have some issues. Most of the time that's not the case. The longer you go, the better your chances of staying that way are. But I think it's really up to your wife to work her program honestly and sincerely, and what she does with that is really beyond your control. You're powerless over that and powerless over what she does. What I think I would emphasize to you is to really take care of you in terms of getting the support you need, making sure you're clear on your boundaries and express those to her accordingly, and really take care of yourself and build your own network of connections and social support, rather than kind of living, waiting for her to do something or not. And that's going to be really important. I've seen marriages really work out well this way, but I just don't think anyone can say to you, it's going to be fine or it's not going to be fine. It really depends on how your wife works the program and her intention and your intention. So, Scott, did you have more to add to that?
No, if she's diligent about her recovery and rigorously honest in all aspects of her life, trust will slowly return, but it's going to take a year to 18 months from, another 6 months to a year before, you really start to stop questioning, mostly, just get a little better.
And that's based not only on time, but on, witnessing 1,000 little decisions, the right decisions of things. What does she do here in this case? And what does she do there in that case? And, how communicative is she? And all that stuff that just takes time. And the addict always wants that trust to be reestablished on a much faster timetable than the partner, because the partner's really been traumatized. And,
although the partner often wants it to trust way before that he or she is ready to trust too. which I think is
right, because that desire to
question. You want to start trusting, but you're not there yet.
Yeah.
You know, and that's normal. It's normal.
Yeah.
So
just make sure that you're going to a program of recovery of some sort yourself, so you can get that assistance and talk to other people who are in similar situations. And Scott, do we have a meeting for male partners of sex addicts? I think we do, right?
we do. I think it's Thursday night. But
because I have had male partners of female sex addicts who felt a little bit stigmatized and some shame, and they go to a meeting, and it was all women, and they felt out of place. But we do have a meeting online for men in that situation. So please look it up if we don't have it for you. But it's on this site, Sex and Relationship Healing.
Yeah, definitely. Last question here. Are there fundamental differences between a porn addict and a sex addict? David, you want me to take this one? Working with Dr. Rob on exactly this.
Oh, so you should probably answer this. Yeah, I mean, I think really I look at addiction as all different behaviors that are rooted in the same set of emotional issues. And so we often see the two combined. We can see just plain porn addicts, but I think they're all kind of symptomatic of an underlying addiction, different expressions of it. Now, with certain generations, like the younger generation of men we're seeing with porn, it's a slightly different trajectory than normal, but I think you can combine them, you can have them separate, but I think it's, in my mind, it's all one big addiction, that it's expressions of different addictions, that behaviors that represent this underlying piece.
For me, a porn addict is a form of a sex addict. But one of the things we're finding, and David mentioned, particularly with the younger crowd, is they don't really identify as sex addicts because all they've ever done sexually is look at porn and masturbate. So they struggle to say, I'm a sex addict, when they've never had sex. They've been sexual, but they've never had sex. So, you know, that's the difference. You know, the underlying drivers are pretty much the same, and recovery is pretty much the same, unless it's a conditioned addict. You know, completely conditioned with no trauma. Recovery diverges, but not right away in recovery, but eventually. We got one more. Let's take one more real quick, and I'll just give a quick answer. What's your advice on someone who has acted out with someone in their program? Is avoidance the best way, or is addressing the person afterward better?
Well, I think avoidance is really important. I think sometimes it may need to get worked out in a very brief way with intention, but I think steering clear is probably the best bet in the short term, at least.
I just got a text. We have to close the meeting. There's another one starting. Sorry, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and I'm going to zap us out really quick.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
We'll be back next week.